So much, Gabby. Thank you for joining our panel today to learn with and from our brilliant panelists about the intersection of climate justice and digital innovation. Though often considered separately, technology can support climate justice efforts, but can also take an environmental toll. So in our mission to invest in a sustainable future, we've asked our panelists to examine how and where technology aligns with the movements for climate justice and where it might work against them. And with that in mind, let us introduce the wonderful panelists that we have with us today. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Sandra Scott, Dr. Derek Gladwin, Dr. Kshamta Hunter, and Dr. Keri Ewart. So Dr. Sandra Scott, thank you so much for being with us today. Dr. Sandra Scott work is guided by wonder as the heart of inquiry and eco-pedagogy, which she views as learning in, from, and alongside nature, with nature as companion, teacher, mentor, and guide. Science education is her home, and her experiences developing relationships, teaching, and learning alongside her students provide the foundation for all of her pedagogical pursuits. Dr. Sandra Scott welcomes and guides students on a journey to wonder, whether it be through courses in inquiry, science methods, environmental education, research methods, and beyond UBC in community. Her teaching centers joy, evidence-based hope and optimism, and follows a constructivist approach guided by collective noticings and wonderings. Thank you for being here, Dr. Scott.
So next we have Dr. Derek Gladwin, an associate professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education, LLED, in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. In addition to co-founding the Systems Beings Lab and collaborative PhD for climate action at UBC, Dr. Gladwin has also served as a sustainability fellow and Wall Catalyst scholar in climate and nature emergency. Dr. Gladwin's work explores approaches to education that create societal impact, including building literacy for energy transition, fostering literacy for socio-ecological awareness and action, and prototyping regenerative learning models in higher education, and cultivating conditions for arts-based education. Dr. Gladwin has published dozens of articles and authored or co-edited many books, including Ecological Exile from 2018 and Rewriting Our Stories from 2021. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Gladwin. We would also like to welcome Dr. Kshamta Hunter, who has over a decade of experience in sustainability, learning and teaching, curriculum design, and program management. Dr. Hunter holds a PhD in sustainability curriculum and pedagogy and teaches in the Faculty of Education here at UBC. Notably, she is the recipient of the 2023 President's Service Award for Excellence and is the manager of transformative learning and student engagement with the UBC Sustainability Hub, where she shapes her research ideas into practice. Dr. Hunter's research explores the intersections of sustainability, learning, and leadership using transformative learning and social innovation frameworks. She's interested in designing responsive and relevant integrative curriculum and pedagogical approaches for the 21st century through understanding the development of competencies for innovation towards sustainability. And thank you very much, Dr. Hunter, for being with us today.
Great. Thanks, Gabby. And we'd also like to welcome and introduce Dr. Keri Ewart, who is the Master of Educational Technology Program, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Decolonization, and Anti-Racism and Community Outreach Coordinator here at the University of British Columbia. She's also a dedicated educator and METS practicum instructor, lecturer, and course developer. Dr. Ewart's courses emphasize topics such as environmental racism, environmental sustainability, social inequities, curriculum studies in cultural and new media studies, and advanced critical thinking. Collaborating with government ministries, she integrates environmental sustainability into educational frameworks. Her research aims to foster a comprehensive understanding of challenges posed by climate change, promoting learning, decolonization, and transformative practices to contribute meaningfully to global efforts. Okay, so in today's session, we will ask each of our panelists the same 4 questions, and then we'll take turns to determine who responds first, after which we'll turn to your questions, so the attendee questions for the panelists. And with that, we'll ask our first question. Dr. Scott, if it's okay, we'll start with you and then open the discussion to our other panelists to jump in. So our first question for you today is, what are the key theoretical or pedagogical intersections between digital innovation and climate justice in your work?
Well, I was excited about this question because I always draw upon deep ecology from Arne Naess, and that because of the earth-centered focus of that perspective, and it just opens up the possibilities of not making everything about us, but more of a reciprocal relationship with the earth. So I love that deep ecology, and you'll often see deep in front of many pedagogical pursuits now, and that they're referring to that, beyond the human, incorporating the more than human. And I love slow pedagogy of place, and that's Payne and Watchow's work. And the focus on the affective domain and the cognitive, experiential, cosmological, it's all there. And so I combine those two. And I think, how great is it that, digital innovation can guide us in this work? And I would like to acknowledge my land acknowledgement with my background today is this photo was taken by the Center for Whale Research between Galiano and Salt Spring Island. And this week, by the way, and these are the transient or big orcas, killer whales. And the way that digital innovation has opened up the possibilities for our relationships with the more than human. So we don't have to be in their place. We can collect data ethically, responsibly, and we can see research as a reciprocal process through digital innovation, because this kind of data collection benefits us, but we're not harming the whales. They actually benefit from it because we know who's pregnant, who's not looking well, where are they today. That kind of information, that kind of data is really important. And I was just working with a school on an innovation center and what that would actually look like, and that idea of the inclusion of it. So some of the schools out on a field trip out in the woods, but then the students at school can experience that alongside them through digital innovation. That was so exciting. So no one feels left out, So that inclusion piece, the ethical considerations of it, the other pieces where, we can use digital platform to collect data from like Ocean Networks 3.0. They're a wonderful website where you can go into every kind of cam and look at bears or whales or fish or enter your own data. So that's how I incorporate it in terms of my pedagogical pursuits and also the theoretical underpinnings of my work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. And I'll open the floor to any of the other panelists to jump in.
I'd love to share if I can. So this picture behind me is actually St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which I had the very prestigious honor to visit last May. And the entire purpose of our visit was to work with, I was the lead for a group of faculty members throughout various universities in Canada. And we were really working with other faculty members at different universities, as well as educators, administrators, to look at best practice pedagogy with a focus on social and climate justice. So in St. Vincent, they had just had the eruption of the volcano, followed by tropical storms and hurricanes and floods and droughts, and of course, COVID. And that really underscored the climate crisis that is proliferating the entire world, but definitely on the island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And so we instilled certain guidelines and really the development of the all climate, all environment related initiatives, and focused on specifically low income urban communities within the island. And it was through a lot of development that we've done with the Ministry of the Environment here in Canada to address environmental injustices and really fostering that sense of community resilience And we developed a mapping tool, a digital mapping tool that allowed for residents who necessarily would not have the accessibility to understand the flood risk zones, the natural disaster prone areas, and even ecological vulnerability, such as habitat loss within those areas, for the specific purpose to prioritize conservation. And looking at these theoretical underpinnings of climate justice through digital innovation, it was actually really exciting because community members that had never been involved in, what we talked about, Sandra talked about in that data collection, was the fact that people were able to geotag photos and add videos and narratives and document their own experience and be involved for the first time in advocating for environmental justice. And so we utilized the train the trainer model. We were able to offer workshops, online seminars for climate related issues and share expertise and co-create solutions. So this went through K-12 and beyond higher education, as well as really included different ministries, policymakers, educators, mostly in Kingstown in St. Vincent. And so it was this digital innovation that enabled that scalability and accessibility to learning opportunities that empowered individuals that wouldn't otherwise have seen these intersections of equity and human rights and climate change. And developing, I think, those strategies for advocacy and social change done through these unfortunate circumstances of really climate change wreaking havoc on farms and forests and housing and infrastructures and everything at the cost of cultural rights and cleanliness and healthy, sustainable lifestyles. And so I think that connection between the theory of both climate change, climate justice, and looking for that digital innovation, it came to this really, really lovely head. And that work we've since brought back to Canada and do this really nice intersectionality work between the two. So this is my picture behind in a visit that I had that really kind of pulled in that theory and application piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ewart. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I could jump in. I don't have a nice background as Sandra and Keri to share, unfortunately. Sorry, I should work on that. I will. I would completely agree with both Sandra and Keri. I think digital social and justice systems are inherently connected to climate change. I'm thinking about Oxfam's 2023 report that was just launched, and it reports that the richest 1% of the population produce as much carbon pollution in 1 year as 5 billion of the most poorest of the 2/3 in our globe. So my research and teaching kind of revolves around this idea of justice and how do we bring that into climate and sustainability education. As Sandra, I'm also a constructivist, and so my pedagogy sort of relate to that kind of like really engaging with the justice issues that are related to climate crisis and the digital innovation. And really trying to guide these pedagogies and curriculum through the justice lens. Otherwise, their evolution or the digital innovation that we are thinking about will continue to disproportionately burden the poor and the marginalized communities, which Keri kind of pointed out to. Another kind of theoretical lens that I use is the transformative learning theory, which really tries to understand how people learn and develop meaning-making structures and construct their own realities in some ways. So how do we engage students through those perspectives and various different frame of references? And I think this idea of transformative learning and constructive philosophies, they really try and support this learning, but also learning and engaging with the issues that are relating to climate justice and technology, which are much needed. So it's that intersection of transformative learning and constructive philosophies with the lens of justice that I try and approach in my own work.
Well, I guess I should jump in here. It's great to be here, actually, and I was excited about this panel because as I was sort of preparing for it, I thought, well, these are questions that interestingly are difficult to answer in some ways, and there's so many different ways to approach them. But I was actually more curious and interested what everyone else has to say. So I'm enjoying sort of receiving some of the panelists, and maybe the questions from the participants audience here will be really helpful and kind of teach me a bit more. You know, it's an interesting question, because I found my work has emerged and adapted over the years, and very much because I look at things like you know, educational systems or environmental or ecological systems and digital kind of literacies. Those things are always changing in themselves. So I feel like I'm always having to adapt and work with that. And I think the thing that's given me a lot of I don't know, hope, I would say, or at least feeling a sense of understanding around engaging with these really larger topics are seeing the value of kind of systems literacies and complexity education, and you know, really seeing how, you know, less of the specifics of digital innovation and climate justice, but the conditions in which we work, and how we change the conditions, which then, of course, lead to more larger systemic or societal changes, which sounds a little diffuse in a sense, and it kind of feels that way in doing this work, but just kind of trusting that you're really building a better soil. So what grows out of that soil, whether you may not know the outcomes, at least you know it's going to be generative, and you can regenerate it in more sustainable ways. So, you know, for me, it's just been really increasingly evident that, you know, educating for this complexity is really a compelling alternative, you know, to those kind of more Western reductionist approaches that have dominated science and educational research really for more than a century, and still predominantly dominates it now. Of course, there are increasingly pockets where this isn't happening, and you know, panels like this, certainly I've heard a lot of interconnections and you know, co-creation and relationality, everything from everyone speaking. So, you know, these terms, of course, are becoming more of the vernacular, but changing those systems, I think, are tricky. So, yeah, I mean, I think if complexity theory is kind of considered this orientation or understanding complex phenomena, it involves interconnected, unpredictable, and interdependent factors of relationships of these various systems. And so we hear terms like, you know, polycrisis is a more common term now, not just a crisis, but all these overlapping crises. And then, of course, the term VUCA, you know, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And, you know, both of these really point to this need and capacity for, I think, training in complex systems and things like ecology and digital media. And so, you know, both digital innovation and climate justice work, I think, requires this type of education and incorporating curricula that really works on systems change, which, not to be ironic, but is very complex, you know, for educators, because we're not trained in this and students are trained in this, and then suddenly we're trying to change within a system that can be quite linear and reductive, trying to make it more expansive in these ways. So, you know, as many have reminded us, there's a common refrain, but, you know, we can't solve the problems in the thinking from the same worldviews in which they emerge. And that's kind of I think, the refrain for systems change. So, you know, shifting these kind of ontological educational frameworks from these more linear models of education that really function as causal outcomes, you know, I think would really benefit from more of the overlapping, you know, sociological, digital, ecological systems that really we're sort of all talking about. And certainly the digital and ecological systems might be some of the most impacting of them all in terms of how they are impacting society, culture, you know, governance, all sorts of aspects. So I guess that's just a way in which to enter in this discussion, to say that you know, kind of embracing for that complete paradox and ambiguity and uncertainty is I think a strangely helpful thing in engaging with these larger topics that are tricky to find, you know, a very definitive answers to.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful answers and sort of a slice of the sort of areas that you're working in. For our next question, we'll start with you, Dr. Gladwin, and then again, as with the first question, we'll ask the remaining panelists to jump in. So our question is, we often think about moving from the tangible, so in-person or in print methods, to digital methods as sustainability work. But is technology always the solution? How do you evaluate the environmental footprint of digital innovations or alternatives to ensure that we're moving towards sustainable efforts and not just band-aid solutions?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And, you know, I found myself struggling a little bit with this, trying to respond. So I'll kind of improv and work through that, and we can grow, we can co-create this question together. Maybe that's my invitation to the panel. But it's interesting because and this relates to the transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary question we'll get to, but it's funny. It depends on the discipline how much we think technology is the solution, and that might be more of a commentary on disciplinary perspectives than it is, that's really the question. And if I go to applied sciences and spend time with a bunch of colleagues and friends over there, technology is a centerpiece of everything, and there are some really amazing solutions coming out of that. And I think that's such an important aspect to this work. On the other hand, there's a over-reliance on technology going to be the fix-all. So I guess the short answer is balance is always a good approach with anything. And balance does require a certain level of social responsibility as well, in terms of finding that balance can be the hardest thing, in fact, as we tend to stray to the extremes oftentimes, historically. So, I'm reminded here of this concept of techno-utopianism. I don't know if we've heard of this concept, but that technology will always be the solution to our future challenges, and we just need to wait long enough and technology is going to fix it. So, even though technology is important, I think it really hinges on whether these technologies or not are coming out of, generative frameworks. Where are they coming from? And what I just spoke to, what are the systems the technologies are emerging out of? What are the soil that those technologies are coming out of? Are they coming out of more individualistic kind of frameworks? Are they coming out of capitalistic frameworks? Are they coming out of socially unjust frameworks, colonial frameworks, and so on? Those technologies, just like digital media, are ultimately going to reflect where they're emerging from. So I think it's very important, again, to changing the conditions so that the technologies that come out of those conditions will be much more of a generative kind of technology. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. I have more to say, but maybe I'll leave it there and hand it over and see what we can do with this one.
Thank you, Dr. Gladwin. Would anyone like to jump in?
I don't mind popping in.
Go for it.
Thanks, Derek. That's amazing. I'm really enjoying this panel. As Derek said, I'm here to learn as well. So this is really exciting to hear everybody's perspectives and also the questions that are coming. I kind of see technology as a method of inquiry. So it's not the solution, but it's part of the solution. And I think it just, it kind of provides a spark for people to engage. So I'm thinking just in my own work, how illuminating it was for people to all of a sudden think, you mean I can use an app on my phone to identify that tree? I've always wondered what that tree is. Or I can use an app on my phone. This is the Merlin app and the Seek app, to identify that bird. I've always wondered what that was. So I see it as kind of just opening up the stories for people, the spark to get them interested. And as a line of inquiry. And as I said before, this is a neat ethical way to do it. With the whales, drone technology has just created such a wonderful community. People are logging into Orca Network to see, okay, so where were the southern residents today? Oh my gosh, J16 is with the new babe, or J35 is pregnant, and it's so exciting. So it's getting people excited about the stories and just furthering the line of inquiry, the method of inquiry. So that's how I see it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I bring a lens of the fact that I teach at the Master of Educational Technology program, which is 100% technology, online, asynchronous, with a couple of synchronous intertwines into there. And really, this reminded me of our core course. So we have it doesn't matter, when people from different a different course code, and everyone's like, yeah, okay, we know exactly what that course code is. So that's not the matter there. It's looking at new foundations in educational technology. And really, one of the assignments or intellectual productions actually calls on students to analyze the sustainability of educational technology tools. And so the students do a really deep dive into Kim Crawford's work, who she states, reflecting on media and technology as geological processes enables us to consider the radical depletion of non-renewable resources required to drive technologies in the present moment. And so as kind of a required task for them, they have to look at and assess the specific costs in specific educational contexts to these tools, the cost benefit of the tools, and identify and classify the types of costs, human costs, digital labor, environmental costs, investigating that particular tool and the life cycle of that assessment of that tool, looking from everything from raw materials and extraction, manufacturing, use, disposal, and really identify those hot spots of those and that environmental impact really for that particular tool. And I think what comes out of this and we have everyone from people who are educators, administrators, instructional designers, health practitioners. I think they understand that energy consumption and the carbon emissions and the e-waste and all of those pieces that are associated with technology use. And if we're looking kind of at an educational model, we can see the SAMR model for anybody who's familiar with that, or even looking at the Bates section model and the effective use of technology for meaningful and purposeful ways. So is it just a pure substitution for a paper and pencil task that can be done in a more sustainable way? Or is it something that is going to redefine learning, redefine use, you talked about the drone, Sandra, and being able to consider it in an ethical context. And so I think really it's that merging between, are we able to use analog or low-tech solutions in a more sustainable way, as compared to using technology just to use it for the fun of using that? And so that's kind of the lens that I approach this, being in a fully online where everything is digital. And it goes to show that if we don't necessarily have a really great tool that's within a digital sense for our students, what is the alternative at that point? And so I find as we're designing and teaching and creating that we need to think really, really deeply about the tools we're using, the technology we're using, and why, in fact, we're using it. So that's my 2 cents.
I would agree with that, Keri, and I also agree with Sandra, because I think there are pros and cons to the technology that we are seeing. But despite their operation in the virtual space, most of these technologies do have emissions, carbon emissions, and consume huge amounts of energy and require quantities of natural resources, including land and water consumption. And these most often are situated in low-income communities, communities that are already struggling with water scarcity and poverty. So how do we balance that digital innovation that can play somewhat of a contributing role in the climate crisis and not perpetuating it? So, for example, I believe like the AI data center server infrastructure plus the operating cost would be, I believe it's reported to go up to $76 billion by year 2028, which is only a couple of years from now. So it's something to be thought about. So I think governments and policymakers really need clear guidelines and changes that require big tech companies to not only be transparent, because a lot of this data is actually not very transparent, and most of these big tech companies don't necessarily share that publicly. So being transparent about their carbon emission data, prioritize reducing energy inputs emission, and also improve well-being of those who are most impacted by these natural resources. So I would also add, I mean, not to be pessimistic here, I would also add that most of these decision makers, I mean, for example, I'm thinking about COP conferences, most of the decision makers who are attending these are also in that top 1% of elite polluters. So how do we negotiate that, and how do we navigate those policy changes to come?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. So for question 3, we're going to start with you, Dr. Hunter. So the question is, as scholars whose work intersects with digital innovation and climate justice in unique ways, how might engaging in collaborative and inter or transdisciplinary approaches to education yield pedagogical benefits?
Yeah, this is a really great question and something that I'm still grappling with as well. I think climate change has really sort of necessitated for us as educators to rethink beyond traditional pedagogies and really enhance that transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches. And it's not necessarily that I think today's education has changed quite a bit in terms of that we don't necessarily are teaching and learning and engaging with challenging issues and topics in the classroom, but we also have to support our students emotionally. And because of the anxieties and the several emotions that come into play as well. Knowing that climate justice is a wicked problem, it's not necessarily discipline specific, so it actually demands transdisciplinary approaches that seek unique and innovative solutions. So I'm thinking about creative pedagogies that are advancing collaboration and working through across disciplines, but also working on some of these multifaceted problems through innovation, cooperation, intentionality, while centering student agency and justice. So one of the approaches that I use is through kindness. So one of the pedagogies that we are working on, Sandra and I actually, on kind of combining climate pedagogies with kindness approaches and trauma-informed approaches. Because if you think of it, while intellect and knowledge are certainly important, they find their highest expression in acts of kindness. So I think we really need to bring that into the education, and these justice approaches and building student agency is really key and central to that.
Thank you. Would anyone like to, Keri, I can see you jumping in. Amazing.
Well, that was awesome. And I think that it leads really, really nicely into the way that I was going to approach this question. But then also I saw that Zeta from False Creek Friends also asked a question that I feel maybe that this might be helpful. So I'm currently working on a project with the Squamish canoe culture. It's an immersive realities project. It utilizes virtual reality, augmented reality, holographic storytelling capabilities, and really for the purpose to revitalize Indigenous art of canoe carving specifically, but also a key kind of token for them is to tackle climate, environmental, water issues specifically using culturally responsive pedagogy. So this is a pioneer grassroots approach to addressing the themes of tradition and resilience and community and ceremonial life and territory, so much history, and really the environment and climate justice and innovation. And you speak to the trauma-informed and kindness and all of those pieces. And this is basically where this is going. So we're currently working with so many scholars, industry experts, knowledge keepers in a multifaceted walks and sort of areas, everything from Indigenous education, the arts, history, departments of natural and environmental resources, Ministry of Education, sciences, technology, so on and so forth. And really the intersection of these different perspectives and methodologies and ideologies, they really offer a holistic view and something that addresses climate justice in a way that's creative and adaptive, and it applies to the different systems of thinking. And so in essence, I know the question came in that how do you get people to really be immersed and get their, I think, the gum boots on and everything, and if you could see the question, and actually get in there when the youth is really would rather be online. And I know I have 2 teenagers myself, and to get them to go out for a walk is like pulling teeth and really getting them. They would rather, oh, can we just go in a virtual setting? Can we go on our goggles? And so this is kind of that hybrid simulation of canoe carving, canoeing on the waters, and addressing the impact of climate change that they have in these waters through 360 videos and through holographic elder storytelling, and looking at opportunities for direct engagement with policy makers and change makers, with being able to partake in these outdoor experiences, but within this virtual environment. So perhaps using that best practice pedagogy, I know that Sandra spoke to on constructivist and constructivism learning, it's really kind of a great space to align different technologies in meaningful ways to really bring about stories, but then address awareness for climate issues in these respects. And from individuals who might not be able to tell their stories, or who told their stories through video, that those videos would eventually be lost. So how a holographic feature where that person is standing right in front of you, whether in a virtual or physical sense, that can share those stories. So there's some really neat ways to utilize technology to be able to solve these problems in unique and innovative ways through that transdisciplinary approach.
Thanks, Keri. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I don't mind jumping in. I feel I'm talking a lot, but I just wanted to mention that, you know, if disciplinary science in a Western view was working, then we wouldn't have climate denial. So, and a speaker you're hosting, Ellen Kelsey, Dr. Ellen Kelsey, it's all about evidence-based hope and evidence-based optimism. And those come from, as Keri was saying, those come from the stories. And Dr. Brian Brayboy presented last week, and I loved what he said. Where does the evidence come from? And let me read you the list, because I just loved it. It comes from places. It comes from the land. There is empirical data, but how do we think about that data collection? And that's what I was talking about when we collect data on the more than human or the non-human stories, the senses, elder knowledge. I mean, this is the idea of the transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work. That's so important to what we do, intergenerational knowledge, and not just for the human, for the more than human. The Killerwell culture, the Southern residents, this is how they share knowledge. So they pass knowledge down. And let me just give you a quick example. In Howe Sound, there was a huge whaling station in Porto Cove. The whales would not go near that area. And it's just been in the last year that the humpbacks have returned to Howe Sound, because the word is out. It's safe to go there. So I just wanted to share that story and how important it is that we really understand the lived experiences and through the story, not just through the disciplines. Thank you.
Great. And Dr. Gladwin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, these are great. These are really great responses. And Keri, thanks for answering that question and really bring in a very applied example. I think that's super relevant. You know, I've been working in transdisciplinary sort of program building for a while, and it's such a tricky space. It's very rewarding, but it can be, you know, it can be difficult for a lot of the reasons that we're chatting about, because they're quite intersecting, and there's lots of different models. And in some ways it works better when you're in an applied situation than when you're in the educational context, because the educational context can be a bit more confining, you know, particularly I think in the ways that, you know, universities and even, you know, K through 12 are still very much of a singular disciplinary approach. And you know, we are separated into disciplines, and funding comes through disciplines, and curricula comes through disciplines. And so, you know, if you're trying to do interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work across the university or in other contexts, educational contexts, right, you quickly run into all the challenges of hundreds of years of disciplinary training and the roots of that. Those root systems go deep. And so, you know, as I kind of talked about earlier, you know, complex systems-based scenarios really depend upon inter and transdisciplinary approaches. And then the other thing is, admittedly, you know, it can be difficult to pin down these terms. I mean, even transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary are just completely academic terms. And when you're working with external stakeholders or communities, I mean, these, you know, it's like find another word, because these terms don't really function in the same way. But in the educational context, of course, these are the terms we use, and we have to kind of engage in that. So, you know, I've been in, I mean, I'm sure we have too, but I've been in many, many meetings where, you know, we can't even just get past the idea of what is transdisciplinarity before we get to the work of how that plays out, which is, of course, a typical academic thing of not being able to get past definition. But I mean, generally speaking, and maybe this helps, you know, transdisciplinary education often includes, you know, these various disciplines dissolving into one another that really create new forms of knowledge, right? So it sort of transcends the disciplinary structures rather than kind of individually all working together. How do you even those come together where we transcend out of that kind of, I guess, limiting format? And then through adaptive and collaborative learning, and then usually a partnership with universities and society in some way, you know, working with society as opposed to for it, right? The idea that there's a genuine partnership there, and that could be, of course, communities, it could be NGOs, it could be schools, it could be governments, all sorts of things. So, you know, I guess the question is, you know, how might this play out at a place like university where we are? Different contexts, of course, demand different approaches to it. Yeah, so I'd say in general, I think transdisciplinary work is super important. I think, you know, for me, looking at complexity and systems kind of education, it's essential. And I think that's really a key part about that kind of training. Is, you know, really disruptive of the current systems and really trying to remove a sense of identity or disciplinary certainty, and really kind of being in a space of uncertainty about the kind of knowledges that we are co-creating or that we're working with other groups. So I think that leads quite directly to, again, the ways in which we're educating around digital innovation and climate justice, because I think it's almost impossible, virtually impossible, to approach those topics in anything that's not a transdisciplinary model. I mean, quite simply for me.
Great. Thank you all so much. We'll move on to question 4, and Dr. Ewart, we'll start with you if you don't mind. And our question is centered around how both environmental education and digital literacy remain marginal in teacher education programs across Canada. And so we're wondering what barriers you face in your pursuit to implement climate justice and technology in teacher education, and whether you've experienced resistance, whether from institutions or students who have different perspectives and opinions about climate change.
This is a good one. I think for me, the largest barriers would be the fact that allocation of time to devote to the issues, the structure for delivering in a fully asynchronous environment, and really the availability of space and course material and those who prioritize climate justice, environmental education. So unless it's been integrated into a course by the course designer that they place that prioritization on, that often instructors will hold different opinions about the urgency for addressing climate change and topics involving environmental education, environmental justice, sustainability. So for instance, we have 2 courses that I teach currently right now. One is Makerspaces and Inclusive Participatory Learning Ecologies. And so we've created this space where students are able to engage in topics of environmental education, climate change, justice through provocations and maker challenges, and that inquiry to utilize digital literacies and frameworks. And the other one is through a curriculum jamming course where students have to look to see the different missing voices, missing content representation within that. And one of the topics is environmental education in curriculum. So over the years, I've been teaching the course for the last 3 years, and you have individuals who are very focused on environment. They have locales, in their locales, they have awareness campaigns, things like that. And then you have the polar opposite, where students think very strongly about the fact that climate change is a conspiracy. from the government. And I was very pleased over the course of research and inquiry and all the data that they're collecting and things like that through this curriculum jam, that all students ended up doing a huge deep inquiry, and the results ended up with them understanding the necessity to put steps in place to both jam curriculum in a critical way, but in doing so to really influence educators, influence policymakers. And so there was a lot of resistance with people in terms of opinions and where their own awareness was. And I think that these explicit ramifications through inquiry, through providing these opportunities, and through the affordance of having a deep dive and providing that opportunity, and it doesn't matter the content, and I think we addressed that earlier, is that even doing panels like this with LDDI and placing that intersection between climate change and environmental justice and digital technologies, I think this allows for that collaboration and ongoing discussion in those pieces. So it allows us to overcome the barriers and prioritize environmental education through, in my program, multiliteracies, multimodalities, pedagogy, andragogy theory, and so forth. But I have received that resistance, and I have had some pushback in certain areas. And I think a lot of it comes from maybe just not being open or necessarily aware or to all the issues. And the minute there is that growth mindset, we call it that maker mentality, to know that it's that positive failure and you learn through inquiry and just being open to different perspectives and ideas. I think that that's where those barriers have been overcome. Obviously, we still run into those barriers, but trying to find really unique solutions to overcoming those has been exciting, I would say, especially in this day and age. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ewart. I know it's a complicated question to answer, but if anyone else would like to jump in, you're welcome to.
I can jump in and say I completely agree with Keri here. I teach pretty intense courses and time-wise, and I completely agree with that it just isn't enough time to really cover the depths. And I would agree that I've had some pushback because most of my courses are through this very climate justice lens and sustainability education lens, even though this is a science methods course or environmental education course. But these are 6 weeks, 4 weeks courses. And I feel like we don't have enough chance to sit with the material, be uncomfortable with that, be able to reflect on it, question it, and then be okay with it. We don't have that time to go through that process for a lot of the students that are in my class. So I appreciate the timing is something that we definitely need to be able to grapple with some of the issues that we are dealing with. I don't think I have come across that many or that many individuals where I have to convince that climate change is happening. But there are, like, teachers want to teach this in their classroom, but they just don't know how. They don't feel equipped. And by the time I'm there to say, okay, you're like, you have to just be okay with uncomfortable topics and complex topics to bring into your classroom. And we just don't have enough time to kind of grapple with that and for them to sit with that uncertainty and just uneasiness of those topics. So I feel like timing is definitely something that I would argue for we get more of.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. And Dr. Scott, Dr. Gladwin, either of you, if you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in quickly. Agreed and echo those responses as well. And I've actually found really great support for environmental education and digital literacy at UBC. And speaking with colleagues around the world, that just gets reinforced the more that I sort of have those kind of anecdotal stories. So I feel fortunate. I feel we're fortunate. We're in a space that, for the most part, is trying to really push and change these conditions. And then, of course, I find these topics, as I've already said, quite complementary. I think maybe one of the challenges about this work is also a benefit in that sense that there is a relatively high degree of awareness for these issues, which isn't to say it stops there. It's just we can build up and get more and go deeper, going back to Sandra's, deep ecology, we can actually go deeper in some of these kinds of elements. But in the teacher education program, particularly, trying to sort of make more core mandated courses that do give a general environmental literacy or educational perspective, much like courses that are that are required, that are educating teachers around indigenous or decolonizing forms of education. And there are, of course, other courses as well, as opposed to electives. And right now, a lot of the environmental courses are electives, and there isn't just one mandatory course that everyone has to take that, whatever that course is. I'm not saying it has to, hopefully that could be co-created, but there's some sense of just something where they have an essence of it. And of course, the BC Ministry of Education, not that recently, 5 years ago, whatever, kind of changed their curricula approaches, and environmental education was one of those. So is digital literacy and innovation. So, I think the BEd program can reflect that. The footnote on that, of course, is trying to change or make a required course in the BEd program is virtually impossible. So that's the tricky part. It's good to see there are more electives at least available that students can take, but just trying to give students the exposure to those courses, because I know in the many courses that I teach that have some sort of environmental topic or digital topic, students are always hungry for these courses. They want more. They're asking for more. I'll recommend other people who are teaching these courses, trying to give them and they kind of, pull them together. And these are students who already have an incentive and interest to it. So I'm sure there are many who don't necessarily have that immediate lock-in, and then there's opportunity to sort of invite them into other ways around that. So anyway, maybe I'll stop there and hand it over to Sandra.
Thanks, Derek. I agree. I think we have work to do in our Faculty of Education. Look at us. We're so great. We should form a working group. Talk about transdisciplinary. Why don't we? Because I think we need someone to spearhead that, and I think we could do it. The students want it. The instructors are excited about it. We can incorporate these ideas into, when we hire instructors, we can put it into our job adverts. I actually do for science. You have to teach this. I mean, it has to be part of your curriculum. So I'm excited. I think we should do this. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Dr. Scott. And we're actually going to stick with you for our next question, and eager to learn from you about, basically how teacher education institutions are kind of considered spaces ripe with potential to transform educational systems and shape the knowledge and skills of future generations to create a more sustainable future. And so we're wondering what unconventional and kind of non-traditional pathways you foster to empower students to effectively address complex environmental challenges.
Well, I think it's important for us to get out of the classroom, and we can do that in digital ways. Just in some of my, say for inquiry, what we did is we watched, the Fat Bear contest. So everyone got involved in the bears up in Alaska, even though we weren't there. So you can do it in a digital way, but actually getting them out of the classroom into community. And this is where I think our community field experience is really important for the teacher education students, because it can have the kind of lens that we're talking about here. And we can use digital innovations through that. You can share your experiences with others through technology. So I think that is, I would say, I like our community field experience. I think it's quite unconventional. Not many teacher education programs have it. And I think it's something we can really focus on, being in community and sharing the stories there. Also, I was thinking, I was talking about my course outlines. And so we have a biology course, a biology methods course that we teach. And I've said no more real animal dissections in that course. And that was really tough because you're talking to science people, that's all they've done if they've taken biology. And they just don't, they're very, you know, that's how you learn about other animals. And so that's been a tough one. It's unconventional, but there's quite a bit of support for that. And once the students sort of understand the perspective of the other, more than human, then they say, okay, maybe we can do this in a different way. So that's been hard because we have a lot of specimens still in our labs that are sitting in, as Kshamta knows, in the cupboards there. And so what do you do with those? There is that ethical to just leave them. So it's just making that transition to sort of non-traditional ways of teaching. Yeah, and I also think just our land acknowledgements that we were talking about. And I know some people you know, share stories as the land acknowledgement and how we can transform that. Like today I shared the stories of the whales behind me as my land acknowledgement. So just thinking a little bit differently and making it more contextualized within community and with community. And I think we do it actually really well in our program because we have such great instructors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Anyone else want to respond to that question? It's a tough one to follow.
I can go ahead. It is a tough one because I agree with absolutely everything that you say. And I think we, you know, as EDIDA coordinator, it's really, really important that the IDA frameworks are intertwined into everything and really embedded in everything we do. And first people's principles of learning, looking at the work and approaching it from a holistic, responsive, and reflexive lens, and understanding that reciprocal nature and experiential learning. And I think that place-based learning piece and that attached community embedded piece. And so I know that we just recently, I would say over the last year or two, formally started practicum placement programs for our Master of Educational Technology students. One of these placements is with Pinqua, which is a nonprofit organization, works with rural and remote Indigenous communities to bring maker activities and place-based learning and back to the land. And I think in terms of this is where the students really get a deep understanding of environmental challenges. It empowers students with these practical solutions. And they work with a mentor, both from the organization, plus they work with community members. They work with elders, they work with knowledge keepers, knowledge sharers, and really how to leverage technology in ways that will help to augment their experience, but then also propel their experience in a very non-traditional way. So I absolutely agree with Sandra with what you said in terms of that experiential piece, using technology in a way that can not necessarily, yes, get on the land as much as possible, but when that's not possible, leveraging those experiences in non-traditional ways. And I think a huge non-traditional way is to move past the really Eurocentric style of teaching and execution and delivery, and thinking about, and this goes to the heartfelt territorial and land acknowledgements, is thinking about unlearning, relearning, and identifying ways to decolonize practice and moving through your own truth and reconciliation process in a means to really push back to that status quo and what traditional even means. And really, what does it mean? It's traditional European, you know, Eurocentric style of teaching within this day and age, but how are we pushing past that? So I think for me, that would be the biggest connection between non-traditional ways of learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ewart. Would anyone else like to jump in?
Sure, I can jump in. When I was thinking about this, I'm thinking, of course, we need to move beyond the traditional ways of learning and teaching. In my work, I take a lot of inspiration from Dr. David Orr's work, and he says one of the things he says is that, you know, the political, the climate, and the social crisis that we are engaging with today is primarily the works of the most educated people in the world. So what is wrong with their education, and how do we transform that education? How do we move beyond that type of education? So it's not the education that will save us, it's what kind of education. And I think thinking through those lines, I use this narrative of values-driven education in my work. And how do we bring values into the education system? So, you know, I mean, I've done this work from last about 10 years, and every year when I engage with the university students, about 95% of the students report that they have never spoken about values in their academic career, ever. And I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem that we are keeping our own personal value systems away and not engaging with them in the education and the professional system. And that's where the problem lies. We need to bring those and connect those systems together. So how do we engage with those values of reciprocity, kindness, resilience, and responsibility? So those indigenous values, but also values that individuals bring in the classroom. So how do we explicitly talk about those in our education system? So, you know, I would be happy to talk to people about those approaches, some of the approaches that I've engaged with my students, and they have been really rich experiences for students to connect with each other individually as well, but also with the challenges and topics that they're engaging with.
Yeah, great. Well, I guess I'll conclude this this question to say sort of 2 points. One is really quick, and that is, you know, one of the ways that I think I engage this question is what I've already talked about around systems literacy and complexity. Of course, this is a, you know, a typically kind of a foreign concept for a lot of learners. But it's intuitive once they start getting it. You know, we use words like holistic in this panel, and this is all interconnected in that kind of, you know, approach. But actually, you know, many ways we do this, at least in the Faculty of Education, this is a priority, and that is, you know, traditional Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and decolonizing education is very much of a systems approach and systems literacy approach. There are others, you know, that come from Western sciences and that sort of thing, different cultures around the world. So, you know, there are many examples to sort of draw on and sort of reframe that. And then I guess kind of connected to this, and maybe one that I find in the climate discussions rarely come up, which surprised me because they're so integral, I think, and that is really the in learning, at least in educational context, encouraging, you know, relational learning as opposed to individualistic. And I'm even talking about that as a larger ontology, like how we are an individualistic culture focused on the self versus how we're relational and how we ultimately create meaning as social beings together. And I think that's one of the most fundamental challenges, because of course everything is downloaded to the individual responsibility, and that individual has to bear the weight of really what's a systemic world, you know, and of course that's going to be crushing because who can hold that weight? So, you know, the environmental movements are a part of this too, right? They love to focus on the individual responsibility, and you know, so it's not, it's sort of, it's all parties involved, not just necessarily one. And so, you know, in that, you know, paradigm, you know, especially in the digital world too, we think about, you know, the TikTok or Instagram, you know, it's really sort of looking at ourselves and who's our true selves, and that attention industry around even social media really starts with the individual first, and then relationships might be a byproduct of that, as opposed to having the relationship be the primary source of our engagement. And then we've created this kind of individual aspect, a byproduct out of that as well. So, you know, I guess if assigning this individual responsibility arbitrarily really separates, you know, the person from those larger systems that they're involved in, then the relational responsibility can really offer a different approach. And by relational, you know, I mean that really we co-create meaning in the moment. This is what we're doing. We are being relational right now. We are in a panel where we're creating meaning as we speak and use language and discourse, and that meaning is very much co-constructed. And so there's a lot of sort of presence and agency in that kind of work. And it can be quite empowering. So I guess that's kind of a underlying aspect to sort of saying, and again, disciplines are kind of connected to that too. We talked about disciplines are like individual identities that we've kind of brought along, but all these things kind of play into how do we really learn together, and that of course fundamentally changes our worldviews about how we engage with digital innovation and climate justice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gladwin. And we will stick with you as well for our last question for the panel. So if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts first. So our final question is, how can online movements support or hamper our understanding of issues related to environmental and technological research and data that aren't always accessible, available, or effectively communicated to the public?
I think I'll answer this with a story. And that is to say that I'm a musician, and I do sort of experimental sound stuff, and recently had a show. And it was in an art, I won't mention names, but it doesn't matter. But it was for an art society, and we had to kind of submit a poster for their Instagram feed to promote the show. And so we did a poster that was AI art. And the background is the people on the team are all connected to digital technologies in some ways. And one of the people on the team has been a designer for 20 years, did the old analog design, now does, AI design. But it was a very conscious choice to use AI art. And we got all sorts of backlash for that. And then they went after the arts community. And then when the arts community said, hey, this isn't our deal, the artists just post what they want. And then they kind of went after a few other people, and they're just looking at somebody to go after. So the designer in our sort of sound experience group kind of came out and said, no, I did this, and I'm happy to chat about it. Let's have a dialogue. This was a conscious choice. I wanted to do this. And I guess the big argument was that AI is, of course, taking jobs away from artists that make these kinds of posters. And eventually this kind of died out, and it played its course, and you had your handful of quite vocal commentators, and then that was that. So we decided to submit a panel to a conference, and as a sort of open call where we could have a dialogue with the community and this art center on this very topic, because of course Instagram didn't suit that kind of generative sort of dialogue to say, hey, this is a really important topic, and there's no real clear answers on this. So how do we engage with the idea of how much should or could we use AI in terms of engaging with kind of arts practices and arts communities? And of course, you can move that to different kinds of locations. So I guess there's sort of an example to say that these movements, or the ways in which we communicate about some of these kinds of changes, and a topic like AI, I think can be done generatively, and they're oftentimes done not so generatively, and the forms of communication in the digital social world oftentimes don't function very well for those kinds of spaces. So I guess one of the questions I have is, how do we create those dialogues in kind of a diffuse world where we're not all able to sort of be in a space where we can do that? And how do we create those spaces? And will those spaces, even if they're created, really benefit to inviting that kind of dialogue about some of these more challenging issues?
Thank you, Dr. Gladwin. Would anyone else like to jump in?
Well, I'll share a story. Oh, sorry, Keri, you go ahead, and then I'll share my story after you.
I don't really have a story. I just have the connection, really, if we think of social media as a way to support. Thinking years ago of Greta Thunberg and looking at the Fridays for Future, and I think raised a huge amount of global awareness, when it came to climate change and the urgency for that need to action. And I think it also empowered youth to realize that one person could do so much. But then also on the flip side of that was misinformation. And I think that that would be more of a hindrance as well. And so many people are creators and influencers nowadays. And I know you ask a lot of youth, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they say, I want to be a TikTok influencer or something like that. And that's a real kind of goal for people. And we see things like the anti-GMO activities and the deep fakes and those chemtrails and conspiracy theories and all of those pieces. And I think it just comes down to how are we utilizing technology in a way that's very critical, and that we're addressing biases and we're addressing those confirmation biases. And I know Kim Crawford again speaks at length about that. And these echo chambers that exist in this participatory culture, right? That reinforces each other's doubts to a detriment, really. But then also on the flip side, could be utilized to really raise awareness in different issues. You know, I was just thinking there's those projects like eBird for bird watchers, or iNaturalist for enthusiasts for wildlife. And really it's providing an opportunity for the average individual to be able to contribute to that data and help, for instance, understand bird population distribution throughout the world or biodiversity research. And it's an exciting time that it's that first time that people are able to contribute to that. Mind you, it's digital labor, really, if we think about it, but to that collection and presentation of data that wasn't otherwise able to come from just somebody who's not a scientist or not in the field. So it's kind of that pros and con piece. I also think of ResearchGate, like if we think of ourselves as academics, and academia.edu, where you can facilitate these collaborative, and like Derek was saying, these panels and these collaborative interdisciplinary knowledge and discussions to share those research findings in a realm that really advances environmental and technological research in that respect. So it's kind of that give and take of really thinking critically about the information that you're seeing, that you're not an expert because you've watched a Netflix documentary, or that you've seen something on Facebook or TikTok or whatever that you say, oh, I know everything there is about that particular topic. So it's there to talk about sort of those hindrances and the support. But I think it's a fascinating time, really. Thank you. Now, Sandra, I would love to hear your story because mine wasn't very fascinating.
Yes, it was. I love it. And the Great Backyard Bird Count just concluded. And what I think is so cool about that is that you can see the map of the world. And every time someone submits their checklist, a little light is a little pin of light lights up on the map. And it's so cool to see where everybody's submitting. I mean, that part itself is just incredible. Here we are in Canada watching people submit across the world. So thank you for bringing that up. I just wanted to share, it's going to be a whale story. In 2018, there was the journey of grief. Tahlequah J35 lost her calf. A calf lived about 20 minutes and then died. And what happened is she carried that calf for 17 days on a rostrum. And the online movement around that it was incredible, really. People were watching her online carry her calf, and the comments were fascinating. Take that calf away, don't let her have that. Someone should go in there or take it. And other people were saying, oh, you've got to, feed her, give her some food and help her. And there was all this sort of the human intervention piece of wanting to help out this mother who was actually grieving, and we had to let her have this time. But what was so cool is that we all knew that. Educators, yes, she's grieving. Indigenous, the Lummi Nation, yes, she is our daughter. She is grieving. She's sending us a message. Even the scientists, the whale people who just are so focused on empirical evidence were saying, yeah, she's grieving. That's what's happening. And that's was so powerful about that movement. And it was all over the world. People were creating art pieces around it, stories. I share it in my courses, and in the end, we're all crying about it because she had lost this calf. The neat thing is that she did have another calf 2 years ago, and who's doing just great. So there's always that little story of hope at the end too. So I just wanted to share that as an online movement that was very sad and powerful. And then there's much hope there as well. Kshamta.
I don't know if I can go after that. That story definitely made me cry. And I think it was a powerful narrative to be kind of discussed in the digital world in some ways. I mean, thinking about what you said, you should witness some of the conversations that I have with my 14-year-old daughter and what she's learned on TikTok, and then the arguments that we have. It's great because she is critically analyzing and asking me questions, which I'm really impressed by. But at the same time, like, you don't know the whole story. So it's kind of like a lot of back and forth, and it's interesting because I think relating this to the education, and I think it's really important to integrate in our teaching and learning about diversifying where we are consuming our information and our news from, but also critically analyzing what we are consuming in a lot of ways. And I think that has become more important now than ever. Because of the fake news and all the things that exist in the world. I mean, some of the examples that I'm giving I can give is just big companies also controlling the narrative. So, for example, the carbon footprint that was released. It was really the big oil firm BP wanting to bolster their image and hiring a public relations firm to say, hey, let's release this and put the blame on consumers. It's individuals who need to be controlling their consumerism instead of putting the blame on the producers who are making trillions from pumping oil and gas. Kind of thinking about more today, I'm thinking about what's not in the digital world. So what's hiding? How do we bring that? We are talking about digital innovation, and we are consuming a lot of information through digital narratives, but a lot of the information all about the platforms is hidden. I'm thinking about cobalt mining in Congo. I'm thinking about lithium mining in Argentina, and how it's impacting the communities and the big firms who are going in there making millions of dollars, but the people who are living in there are still not getting even a fraction of the funds that are being raised. Again, kind of perpetuating that climate justice issues that persist very much so. And how do we overcome those and bring that into the real news?
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Hunter. So that is it for our questions that we've prepared for you, but we do have a question from one of our attendees that I think, Dr. Ewart, you sort of touched on a little bit, but I think I will open it up to everyone. So the question comes from Zaida, and it was, as a placemaking environmental organization, we're struggling with connecting with younger volunteers, many of whom seem to prefer virtual or online engagement rather than actually putting on gumboots and getting muddy. So do you have any ideas of how to let go from the comfort of a virtual space, especially for young people, and head over to a real place that needs their attention? Is there a bridge, and do you have any concrete examples to share? So I know, Dr. Ewart, you had mentioned the example of the canoe, and I'm wondering whether Dr. Scott, Dr. Hunter, or Dr. Gladwin, or Dr. Ewart, if you have another example, you would be able to share with us.
Well, I will add they love their phones. So and what Keri was saying, they get those little apps, like get that little Seek app out, get your Cornell, your eBird. And then I think they just really like if they can have their phones and take photos and then upload it and for identification, they just love that. So I've found that's really helped when I take my students out into the forest and then eventually they will actually start using a field guide, which is incredible. They'll find other ways of interpreting the world. But I think it's okay for them to use their phones when they're there. And then they eventually let it go because it's the direct experience that they seem to prefer. So I like the Seek app, and Also the Merlin app for birds. There's so many different ones. So yeah, try it out and see how they go. It's quite fun to do. I love doing it myself.
And just to add to that, Sandra, too, even and especially youth now, teaching them the augmented reality overlay. So for them to take those pictures and for them to take those videos and be able to create their own avatar and add that and explain their opportunities, you're getting them out there in that place, but then you're also adding that layer that resonates with them and creating this very, very immersive experience where they're sharing from each other and learning from each other. And you might say, we were all in the same place. We all took a picture of something that, whatever it is, resonated with us. I want you now to explain using your own avatar and somebody else's picture, how you're perceiving that picture, how you're perceiving that particular opportunity. So it's a way to really enable that immersive experience for them, but in a means to get them out. And they're excited to do so because, oh my gosh, who doesn't want to use augmented reality?
And I would just add to that I think it's good to include cell phones or whatever they're using, different platforms, different softwares in the outdoor learning, but I think it's also about building community. So when they are with the community or core group of people that they really want to engage with and they really love hanging out with, they will be, doing the things outdoors. And that's what I have experienced, that when you take a group of individuals outside, but you give them a task that they really love working and interacting with that community, I think it really works out well. So, and first, I also want to say hi to Zeta, the Falls Creek Community Friends Society does amazing work. So hi, Zeta.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's something certainly that I constantly am thinking about and trying to revise. And so this is helpful to hear some of your responses as well. I mean, working with digital technology, as has been suggested, in kind of an external outdoor place is I think a very useful one, and students definitely resonate. I've also found more and more, it seems like students are getting a little tired of the technology, and they really look forward to opportunities to put the phone down and leave it and do something else. So, different kinds of embodied forms of education I found really helpful, just getting them moving in their bodies. I mean, they like to go outdoors, and of course Sandra's an expert at outdoor education and has all sorts of great ideas how to get them outdoors. Sometimes even if they're not in necessarily the woods or somewhere else, just getting them moving and being outside, and doing different kinds of theater practices, or embodying different kinds of movements and animals, or the more than human kinds of ways in which getting out of the anthropocentric kind of body kinds of forms, doing activities around that, I found students can really engage in. And I think just highlighting one thing in this that I think is really underlying all of this, and that is, and it's kind of underlying, I think, the whole trying to create sort of a social systems change, and that is that comfort of the virtual place. And really sort of a lot of this work is about discomfort. It is about pulling ourselves out of a comfortable kind of paradigm of what we find to be supportive in the ways that our own beliefs or our own systems have supported us. So I think in some ways, that's the big challenge, but opportunity, really. It's a great opportunity to use it as a transition to say, okay, well, how do we really do discomfort generatively? And that's part of the training too, I think, and building capacity and building resilience around, working and challenging difficult topics and times. And, there are ways that can feel very empowering. It's not, and sometimes getting in the body is the best, because our heads don't tell us, what goes on in our heads aren't necessarily the best things. And when we're in our bodies, we can find much more of a flow and interconnection to those more than human kinds of aspects of the worlds that we're connected to.
I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. And I think, sadly, that's all the time that we have for our panel session today. But before we go, we'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to our 4 incredible panelists. Thank you for your time and invaluable contributions to climate justice. And I just want to share some key takeaways for me. As I was trying to like furiously take notes, but you know, for me, the key takeaways were to embrace and sit in discomfort, both alone and with my students, and to be okay with that. To continue to collaborate and share stories openly and candidly, you know, without fear of opposing views. To lead with kindness, and to understand that we are one with nature, and just as nature is not linear and kind of constantly ebbs and flows, we too must embrace the chaos as we seek to advance climate justice initiatives. We'd also like to thank everyone here for joining our conversation today and for posing that one thought-provoking question and comment. Of course, you can email us later on if you have additional questions that we can share with our panelists. I also just wanted to remind everyone that today's session is recorded, and we will be housing that recording on the LDDI website under workshops and events. We'd also like you to complete a brief survey if you'd like to share your perspective on today's chat, and we will also toss that link in the chat if you'd like to complete that survey. And if you enjoyed today's session, you can register for our upcoming Viewpoint session this Friday, March 1st, titled Stories Rooted in Healing the Planet. And we are thrilled and excited to attend that as well. So if you wish to learn more about LDDI, you can connect with us on Twitter and email, or visit our website. So thanks again to all of our panelists and for everyone who joined us today. And we hope you have just a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.